He was once a fire-breathing Yale law professor and the geopolitical titan who fueled the Allied war machine. But by the age of 89, J. Howard Marshall was reduced to a paralyzed, drooling mass of flesh, soiling his diapers beneath a wheelchair blanket. In a sickening display of delusion, the impotent billionaire threw tens of millions of dollars to buy a 26-year-old stripper, financing her massive silicone implants just to have her press her chest against his decaying face for the paparazzi. But the ultimate gruesome karma arrived when his body completely collapsed. He was locked away by his own flesh and blood, a feeding tube shoved through his stomach, left to rot in his own waste. This is the suffocating truth of a man who bought human flesh, only to be financially cannibalized to his last dime. These are the filthy secrets J. Howard Marshall hid beneath his billion-dollar image. The foundation of this psychological fortress was laid long before the oil wells and the stripper poles. Born in 1905 in Germantown, Pennsylvania, J. Howard Marshall II was raised in a strict Society of Friends or Quaker environment. From the very beginning, his world was defined by discipline, silence, and the expectation of intellectual excellence over emotional expression. Many biographers and historical records suggest that this early environment taught him a dangerous lesson, that vulnerability was a flaw, and that safety could only be found in absolute, quantifiable control. He was a young man who learned early on that praise was not given for warmth, it was awarded for achievement. The metrics of his childhood were performance-based, creating a paradigm where affection was earned through utility, not given freely. By the time he arrived at Yale Law School in the late 1920s, he systematically conquered the halls of academia. Yale in that era was a bastion of old money and fierce intellectual combat. The Gothic archways and the heavy oak doors of the institution were intimidating to most, but Marshall thrived in its cold, competitive air. He stripped the law of any noble philosophy, treating it purely as a complex, manipulable machine. If you understood the gears, the levers, and the pulleys, you could control the machine. And if you controlled the machine, you controlled the people subject to it. His brilliance was undeniable. Marshall was so intellectually dominant that he was publishing definitive, highly respected texts on oil law before he had even received his diploma. While his peers were struggling to brief cases, Marshall was identifying the structural loopholes in the American energy sector. In 1931, bypassing the grueling entry-level years of a typical graduate, he was immediately appointed as the assistant dean of Yale Law School at the astonishing age of 26. He was teaching the law to men who were often older than he was. The visual of Marshall in these years is striking, providing a stark contradiction to his final days. Historical photographs from the 1930s show a man with sharp features, tailored suits, and a piercing, unblinking gaze. He walked through the halls of Yale radiating an aura of total invulnerability. He was building a fortress of paper, statutes, and flawless logic. He was known for a commanding, resonant voice that could dissect a flawed legal argument in seconds. He was a man who demanded to be listened to, and the academic elite of the Ivy League obliged. But beneath that impeccably dressed exterior, his fatal weakness was taking deep root. Because Marshall was so successful at navigating the world through intellect and legal mechanics, he began to apply that same cold, transactional logic to human intimacy. He fundamentally lacked the emotional vocabulary to form genuine, vulnerable connections. For Marshall, relationships were negotiations. Affection was something to be audited. He believed that any human problem, a disagreement, a lack of loyalty, a need for companionship, could be solved if you simply applied enough capital or drafted a tight enough contract. In 1931, the same year he conquered Yale, he married Eleanor Pierce. On paper, it was the perfect strategic union. It was a merging of status and ambition. But a marriage cannot be sustained by a syllabus. To Marshall, a family was merely an institution that required proper management and adequate funding. He provided an immaculate life, but he starved his home of warmth. He fathered 2 sons, but he raised them under a regime of rigid expectations. He viewed his children as heirs to an empire, rather than boys needing a father. Up to this point, his brilliance effectively masked his emotional void. The world rewarded his detachment with promotions and prestige. But he was about to leave the theoretical world of Yale. He was entering the treacherous, high-stakes battlegrounds of Washington, D.C., where his mechanical view of humanity would be tested on a global scale. The transition from the hallowed, insulated architecture of Yale to the ruthless, bloodthirsty machinery of Washington, D.C. was practically seamless for a mind like J. Howard Marshall's. By the early 1930s, the American oil industry was not a civilized marketplace. It was a chaotic, violent frontier that was actively tearing the national economy apart. In the heart of the Great Depression, the discovery of the massive East Texas oil field had flooded the market. Renegade drillers, known as wildcatters, were pumping millions of barrels of illegal, unregulated crude, nicknamed hot oil, and smuggling it across state lines. Prices plummeted to literal pennies a barrel. The infrastructure of the nation's energy sector was on the brink of catastrophic, irreversible failure. The federal government desperately needed a regulator, an enforcer who could tame this lawless landscape. They did not summon a hardened, dust-covered Texas oil man with crude beneath his fingernails. They summoned the 20-something academic from Yale. Upon joining the Roosevelt administration, Marshall did not merely assume a desk job. He immediately began to view the United States government as his own personal chessboard. Arriving as a special assistant to the Attorney General, Marshall did not see desperate men trying to feed their families during a depression. He saw a broken mathematical equation. He viewed the wildcatters and the collapsing markets purely as variables that needed to be aggressively corrected. In 1935, applying his cold mechanical logic, he co-authored the Connolly Hot Oil Act. This was not a mere suggestion. It was a legislative iron fist. This single piece of legislation fundamentally altered the trajectory of American wealth by making the interstate transport of contraband oil a severe federal crime. He effectively built a massive legal dam to control the chaotic flood of crude. And in doing so, before he had even turned 30, he learned exactly where the deepest, most sensitive levers of federal power were hidden. In the sweltering, mud-soaked oil fields of Texas, desperate men fought for pennies in the dirt. Miles away, in a pristine, air-conditioned office in Washington, D.C., a young J. Howard Marshall II sat in a bespoke suit, perfectly manicured, halting the flow of millions of barrels of oil with a single stroke of his fountain pen. He was dictating the survival of working-class America without ever having to look them in the eye. To Marshall, power was clean and detached. He was refining his ability to control human behavior through systemic manipulation. Many biographers argue this was the very habit that eventually built the cage he died in. But it was during the darkest, most desperate hours of the Second World War that Marshall transformed from a brilliant government lawyer into a quiet, omnipotent architect of global history. When the Japanese military bombed Pearl Harbor and America was violently plunged into a two-front war, the survival of the free world hung entirely on a singular, highly combustible liquid asset, petroleum. Tanks grinding through the sands of North Africa, heavy bombers darkening the skies over Europe, destroyers hunting in the Pacific. Every single machine of liberation required fuel. If the oil stopped, the Allies would lose the war in a matter of weeks. The federal government formed the Petroleum Administration for War, and Marshall was swiftly appointed as its chief counsel. Battles are fought with blood and courage, but global wars are won entirely by logistics. Out of the 7 billion barrels of oil consumed by the Allied forces during the entirety of World War II, a staggering 6 billion came directly from the United States. And Marshall, sitting in a smoke-filled, heavily guarded office in Washington, was the undisputed master of that colossal logistical pipeline. Far from the muddy trenches and blood-stained beaches, he fought a sterilized war from Washington, drafting the intricate, labyrinthine regulations that dictated how every single drop of American oil was drilled, refined, priced, and distributed across the globe. His public service was defined by a stark contradiction. He was universally acclaimed as a savior of industry, a stoic patriot who commanded the world's resources with flawless precision. Yet, his methods were terrifyingly clinical. He mandated civilian rationing, forcing American families to use gas stamps, effectively grounding the nation to fuel the war effort. He negotiated with ruthless petroleum barons, forcing rival corporations to share pipelines and patents. He was the invisible hand that kept the Allied war machine turning. While millions of young men were bleeding into the mud of foreign continents, Marshall was waging a sterilized, bloodless war on legal pads. He possessed the godlike power to redirect the lifeblood of nations. He was saving the free world, but he was doing it with the emotional detachment of a man auditing a bank. This relentless focus on macro-level control created a gaping silent void on the micro level of his own life. While he was managing the energy reserves of the entire Allied military apparatus, his own home was effectively running on empty. His wife Eleanor and his 2 sons J. Howard III and E. Pierce were living in the affluent suburbs, perfectly provided for, yet entirely starved of paternal warmth. He was rarely home. When he was, his mind was miles away, calculating refinery outputs. In doing so, he was teaching his son, Pierce, a dangerous lesson. True power comes not from empathy, but from controlling the assets. Following the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers in 1945, Marshall stood at the absolute zenith of his political capital. He knew where every pipeline was buried. He knew the legal vulnerabilities of every major oil corporation in America because he had written the very regulations that governed them. He did what any masterful calculating opportunist would do. He cashed in. He resigned from public service, pivoting directly from saving the Republic to building his own private empire. He understood that the post-war boom was going to create an insatiable domestic demand for energy, and he was perfectly positioned to exploit the very system he had spent the last decade designing. Up to this point, his mastery of the rules made him an untouchable, revered god of industry. His profound emotional void was perfectly masked by his staggering professional success. The world saw a genius. They did not see the emotional void at his core. The true danger lay in how he decided to leverage this immense wartime intelligence. He was about to trade the noble halls of government for the cutthroat, unforgiving arenas of corporate capitalism. He was about to enter a phase of aggressive accumulation that would generate unimaginable wealth, but it would also attract the predatory instincts of his own flesh and blood. And this very habit of exploiting legal loopholes for maximum gain would eventually become the exact strategy his son would use to annihilate him. The dust of the Second World War had barely settled when J. Howard Marshall II executed one of the most ruthless and lucrative pivots in the history of American capitalism. Having spent the early 1940s dictating the global flow of petroleum for the Allied forces, he did not return to the quiet, ivy-covered halls of academia. He understood that the post-war era was about to ignite the greatest economic expansion the world had ever seen, and that expansion would be entirely dependent on the very resource he knew better than anyone else alive. He had spent years writing the federal regulations that governed the oil industry. Now, he was going to exploit them. He transitioned seamlessly from the public sector to the private, bringing with him a terrifying advantage. He knew exactly where the legal loopholes were buried because he was the one who had dug them. His empire was forged entirely through an encyclopedic mastery of corporate tax law and a fountain pen. In 1952, he made his definitive move, recognizing the untapped potential of heavy, high-sulfur crude oil flowing out of Canada. Marshall co-founded the Great Northern Oil Company. He orchestrated the construction of a massive state-of-the-art refinery in Pine Bend, Minnesota. The visual contrast between his former life and his new reality is stark. Gone were the polished marble floors of Washington. In their place arose towering labyrinthine structures of steel, massive distillation columns, and flare stacks that burned continuously against the freezing northern sky. He was transforming thick, unrefined sludge into the highly profitable gasoline that would fuel the booming American suburbs. But Marshall was not interested in simply running a refinery. He was playing a much longer, much more sophisticated game of financial chess. He forged a strategic alliance with another titan of the industry, Fred Koch, a man whose engineering genius matched Marshall's legal brilliance. In the late 1950s, Marshall executed a financial masterstroke that would permanently alter his family's destiny. Instead of merely cashing out his profits from Great Northern, he orchestrated a complex corporate swap. He traded his shares in the refinery for a massive 16% ownership stake in Fred Koch's rapidly expanding enterprise, which would eventually be rebranded as Koch Industries. To the untrained eye, giving up direct control of a profitable refinery might have looked like a retreat. In reality, it was the financial masterstroke of the century. Koch Industries was quietly growing into the largest privately held corporation in the United States. By securing that 16% stake, Marshall essentially attached a permanent, invisible siphon to one of the greatest wealth-generating engines in human history. He became a billionaire in the shadows. He didn't have to drill the wells or manage the hostile takeovers. He simply sat back and watched his net worth compound at an astronomical rate. Yet, as his net worth exploded, his domestic life deteriorated. By 1961, his 30-year marriage to Eleanor Pierce finally buckled. The dissolution of their marriage was swift and calculated. He finalized the alimony, signed the documents, and walked away. But the consequences were catastrophic because of who was watching. His son Pierce was absorbing a quiet lesson. In the Marshall family, affection was not a birthright, but a conditional contract. Pierce watched his father discard his mother with the flick of a pen. He learned that the only thing that truly mattered, the only thing that could actually protect you in this world, was the absolute control of capital. Marshall was inadvertently training his son to be a financial apex predator, a predator who would eventually turn those exact same hunting skills against his own father. Marshall was not merely an absent father. Through his actions, he actively mentored his son in the dark arts of emotional detachment and legal warfare. Almost immediately after finalizing the paperwork with Eleanor, Marshall married his longtime mistress, Betty Bohannon. It was a seamless transition, as if he were simply upgrading a component in his life's machinery. To house his new bride and to broadcast his absolute supremacy, Marshall built a palatial, sprawling estate in the exclusive River Oaks neighborhood of Houston, Texas. The River Oaks estate functioned entirely as a fortified sanctuary, designed to intimidate rather than welcome. It was surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns, filled with museum-quality antiques, and guarded by state-of-the-art security systems. It was designed to intimidate anyone who approached its massive doors. But inside, it was a museum of loneliness. He had constructed an impenetrable bubble of wealth to protect himself from the unpredictability of the outside world. He believed that if he just accumulated enough money and built the walls high enough, he would be immune to the suffering that plagued ordinary men. Up to this point, his strategy appeared to be flawless. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, his Coke industry's dividends were generating millions of dollars a year in pure, liquid cash. He was deeply respected by the conservative political establishment, feared by his corporate rivals, and completely insulated by his wealth. He had successfully quantified and monetized every single aspect of his existence. Everything was perfectly managed. Everything was under control. But a silent threat was looming, one that no amount of corporate litigation or federal lobbying could ever prevent. Because as Marshall entered his twilight years in the 1980s, the invisible, invincible armor he had spent his entire life forging began to rust from the inside out. He was about to discover the one terrifying variable that his brilliant, analytical, legal mind could never legislate away: the fragile, decaying nature of the human body. The tragedy was not going to announce itself with a hostile corporate takeover or a subpoena. It was going to arrive in the terrifying silence of his own bedroom, stripping away the mind of his second wife and slowly, methodically paralyzing his own legs. This realization pushed the calculating architect of the American oil industry into a desperate attempt to escape his isolation, leading to a highly publicized and tragic spectacle. The sprawling, heavily fortified estate in the River Oaks neighborhood of Houston was designed to be the ultimate monument to J. Howard Marshall's supremacy. By the dawn of the 1980s, His financial architecture was flawless. His 16% stake in Koch Industries was generating rivers of liquid capital, quietly compounding into a fortune that would eventually exceed $1.5 billion. He was entirely insulated from the economic anxieties that plagued the rest of the nation. He had spent his entire life treating human connection as a liability to be managed, and now he was about to face the terrifying consequences of that exact philosophy. The tragedy of J. Howard Marshall was not going to arrive in the form of a corporate raid or a federal subpoena. It was going to arrive in the absolute terrifying silence of his own home. The first devastating blow was struck not against Marshall himself, but against his second wife, Betty Bohannon. Many biographers and medical records from the era indicate that Betty began exhibiting the cruel, irreversible symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. For a man like Marshall, this diagnosis was not just a personal tragedy, it was an existential terror. This struck at his ultimate blind spot. His entire identity, his immense wealth, and his global influence were built entirely on the absolute supremacy of the human intellect. He was an Ivy League prodigy who worshipped the mechanics of the brain. He had conquered the American energy sector because he could outthink, out-negotiate, and out-legislate any rival. Now he was forced to sit in his palatial living room and watch the intellect of the woman he had chosen to accompany him through his twilight years slowly dissolve into a fog of profound confusion. Here was a titan who had drafted the labyrinthine laws governing the flow of billions of barrels of oil across the globe, yet he was utterly powerless to stop the deterioration of a single human mind. And how did he exercise his power in the face of this incurable disease? He did what he had always done. He attempted to buy his way out of the problem. Some historical accounts suggest that Marshall did not respond with the tender, hands-on care of a devoted husband. Instead, he treated his wife's illness like a logistical supply chain issue. He simply opened his checkbook. He hired fleets of private, around-the-clock nurses. He transformed sections of the River Oaks mansion into a clinical, high-end medical facility. He outsourced the emotional labor of grief and caregiving to paid professionals, isolating himself from the raw, unpredictable pain of watching her fade. He could not cure her, but he could pay to look away. But the betrayal of biology is a relentless prosecutor, and it soon turned its gaze upon Marshall himself. As the 1980s progressed, the architect of the Allied oil supply began to physically wither. The legs that had confidently strode through the halls of the Department of the Interior began to fail him. His spine curved, his muscles atrophied, and eventually, the towering, imposing figure of J. Howard Marshall was permanently confined to a wheelchair. The visual manifestation of his psychological state during this period is stark and deeply unsettling. The man who had once commanded the attention of presidents was now a frail, trembling figure, being pushed by hired help across acres of imported Persian rugs in a silent, empty mansion. His physical universe was rapidly shrinking, and with it, his suffocating illusion of total control. This is the exact moment his fatal weakness began to completely override his brilliant, analytical mind. Marshall was terrified of the dark. He was terrified of becoming irrelevant. He had spent decades writing contracts to ensure his own security, but historical accounts suggest he began to realize that there is no court of appeal for aging, and no contract capable of binding mortality. During this long, excruciating decade, a striking comparison emerges that perfectly illustrates his grotesque reality. Many financial historians note that as Marshall's physical body decayed, the valuation of Koch Industries was exploding. His wealth was growing in direct, inverse proportion to his vitality. He would reportedly sit in his wheelchair, obsessively reviewing his financial ledgers, counting the tens of millions of dollars in annual dividends. He was treating his balance sheets as a psychological shield, desperately trying to quantify his worth as a human being while his body betrayed him. He had all the money in the world and absolutely nothing to spend it on that could stop the clock. Furthermore, the isolation he was experiencing was entirely self-inflicted. His approach to fatherhood mirrored his corporate strategy. His son, E. Pierce Marshall, was frequently in the picture, but their relationship was completely devoid of traditional paternal warmth. Marshall had trained Pierce to view the world through the cold, unforgiving lens of corporate strategy. He had taught his son that assets must be protected, and that sentimentality was a fatal flaw in business. Consequently, as Marshall sat deteriorating in his wheelchair, Pierce saw an increasingly vulnerable chief executive holding the keys to a billion-dollar empire, rather than a father in need of comfort. Pierce was quietly watching the nurses, managing the estate's security, and calculating the trajectory of his father's decline. Marshall had bred a financial apex predator, and now, as he grew weak, that predator was circling the perimeter of his own wheelchair. In 1991, the long, agonizing decline of Betty Marshall finally came to an end. She passed away, leaving the 86-year-old billionaire utterly, profoundly alone. The River Oaks mansion was now a tomb of priceless antiques and deafening silence. The smell of clinical antiseptic lingered in the hallways, a constant reminder of the death he could not outwit. For a man who had always commanded an audience, who had always dictated the terms of reality, this isolation was a psychological death sentence. He was trapped inside a failing, rotting physical shell, surrounded by the cold, hard evidence of his immense wealth, with no one left to validate his existence. Up to this point, his tragedy was strictly private. It was contained securely behind the high iron gates and security cameras of his Houston estate. Everything was still, on the surface, a quiet, dignified decline of a wealthy widower. But the silence of the grave had become far too loud for his fragile ego to bear. He realized that if he stayed in that mansion, he would simply fade into the upholstery and die a forgotten, irrelevant old man. He desperately needed a distraction. He needed a loud, vibrant, neon-lit mirror to reflect back an image of the powerful, virile titan he used to be. And he knew exactly how to get it, because he had spent 86 years learning that anything a man desires can be procured for the right price. He was about to take his pristine, formidable legacy and drag it directly into the flashbulbs of the Houston underworld. The quiet, private tragedy was about to shatter into a grotesque, highly publicized spectacle. The month was October 1991. J. Howard Marshall II, the 86-year-old billionaire who had once calculated the global fuel supply for the Allied war effort, instructed his driver to navigate away from the pristine, heavily guarded enclaves of the River Oaks neighborhood, Bypassing the quiet country clubs and high society galas of his peers, he directed his driver to a sprawling windowless building on the neon-lit fringes of Houston, Gigi's, a notoriously seedy local strip club. The visual contradiction of this moment is absolutely staggering. The cheap, pulsating fluorescent lights and the heavy, smoke-filled air of a midday Texas gentleman's club stood in staggering contrast to the heavy, Gothic wooden doors of Yale Law School, where Marshall had once reigned as a magna cum laude prodigy. Here was a man who had authored federal legislation and stood shoulder to shoulder with the conservative elite of Washington, being slowly wheeled down a sticky carpet toward the main stage. His presence in this stark environment was driven by a deeper terror, the rapid decline of his physical autonomy. Marshall had spent his entire life quantifying human value. He believed that everything, including affection and loyalty, was a commodity that could be negotiated, leveraged, and purchased. But in the agonizing silence of his mansion following the death of his second wife, he realized his vast wealth was completely useless against the suffocating reality of his own physical decay. He was a paralyzed, trembling old man, terrified of dying alone and forgotten. He did not go to Gigi's looking for an intellectual equal, and he certainly was not looking for a traditional romance. He went to a marketplace where the illusion of youth, vitality, and desire was openly for sale by the hour. He was looking to execute a transaction. It was during the undesirable, sparsely populated afternoon shift that the billionaire's wheelchair was positioned near the stage, and it was there that he first laid eyes on a 24-year-old dancer named Vicki Lynn Hogan. She was not yet the globally recognized bombshell Anna Nicole Smith. She was a struggling high school dropout and single mother from the small town of Mexia, Texas, working the day shift just to keep the lights on. The age gap between them was a staggering 62 years. But the true chasm was not just in their ages. It was a collision of two entirely different demographics of desperation. She was desperate for a way out of crushing generational poverty. He was desperate for a way out of the grave. Forgoing traditional romance, Marshall approached the courtship with the exact strategy he had used in the oil industry: overwhelming financial force. According to numerous testimonies and court records, Marshall immediately began handing her crisp $100 bills simply to stand near him and converse. He was establishing the rules of engagement from the very first minute. He was the bank, and she was the asset. During their courtship, Marshall reportedly invited the young dancer to lunch at a local restaurant. During the meal, when she excused herself to use the restroom, he handed her an envelope containing a substantial amount of cash. He told her it was simply a gift to compensate her for the time it took to wash her hands. He was systematically purchasing her attention, creating a financial dynamic where she simply could not afford to look away. But what was he actually buying? Many legal experts, intimate testimonies, and later medical records strongly suggest that Marshall's deteriorating physical condition rendered him completely incapable of consummating the relationship. His 86-year-old body had failed him. Therefore, the millions of dollars he was about to unleash were not paying for physical intimacy. He was purchasing a performance. He was buying a mirror. Marshall wanted the young, hypersexualized woman to drape herself over his wheelchair in public so that other men, younger, healthier men, would look at him not with the pity reserved for a dying invalid, but with the bitter envy of a conquered rival. He was paying an astronomical premium for the privilege of feeling for just a few fleeting hours a day like a powerful virile titan. The financial hemorrhage that followed was unprecedented, even by the standards of Texas oil barons. Marshall essentially put Vicki Lynn Hogan on a massive, limitless corporate retainer. He moved her out of her cramped apartment and into a luxury suite. He bought her a sprawling, expensive ranch outside of Houston, complete with horses. He purchased a fleet of cars, including a bright red Mercedes-Benz. But the most grotesque application of his wealth was how he actively financed her physical transformation. He paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for her expansive wardrobe, her lavish lifestyle, and crucially, multiple plastic surgeries. He funded her breast augmentations and cosmetic alterations. He was literally molding her flesh to fit his specific manufactured fantasy of a modern-day Marilyn Monroe. He was investing massive amounts of capital to increase the market value of his newly acquired property. Through this relentless infusion of Marshall's cash, Vicki Lynn Hogan was completely erased, and the media phenomenon known as Anna Nicole Smith was constructed. By 1992, funded almost entirely by the elderly billionaire, she landed the cover of Playboy magazine and soon secured a massive contract as the face of Guess Jeans. Wherever the newly minted, towering blonde celebrity went, the frail, trembling billionaire was wheeled closely behind her. He became a captive audience to the monster of celebrity he had helped create. But the irony of his master plan is sharp and merciless. By trying to purchase control over his own aging process through her youth, Marshall had actually surrendered his autonomy. The brilliant Yale lawyer had written a behavioral contract where he held absolutely none of the actual power. He was entirely dependent on her chaotic, unpredictable, and highly publicized schedule for his only source of happiness. He was no longer the master of the board. He was merely the ATM. While this highly publicized theater was playing out on red carpets, a different calculation was occurring inside the silent, heavily guarded estate in River Oaks. E. Pierce Marshall, the son who had been trained by his father to view the world as a cold, unforgiving balance sheet, was watching this grotesque spectacle unfold with mounting, calculating fury. Pierce viewed Anna Nicole Smith's presence not as companionship for his father, but as a massive, hostile corporate takeover. He saw a parasite draining the lifeblood of the Marshall family empire. Pierce began quietly, methodically assembling his own legal armory. He sat in his office, tracking the extravagant credit card bills, the real estate transfers, the millions of dollars in jewelry purchased in single afternoons at Harry Winston in New York. He was documenting every single cent bleeding out of the estate. Up to this point, J. Howard Marshall II still genuinely believed he was the one writing the checks and calling the shots. He believed his immense wealth shielded him from consequences, but a lifetime of treating human beings as disposable variables was about to trigger a catastrophic reckoning. He had inadvertently awakened the predatory instincts of his own son. Marshall was funding a highly public spectacle that was drawing the flash bulbs and the media directly to the gates of his family's private empire. And that exact exposure, that blatant, humiliating public display of his father's mental and physical vulnerability, was the exact weapon Pierce Marshall was waiting to use. The trap was set, the ledgers were balanced, and the architect of the Allied war machine was about to be legally annihilated by his own flesh and blood. As the calendar flipped through 1992 and into 1993, the private tragedy of J. Howard Marshall II mutated into a globally syndicated circus. To the millions of Americans standing in supermarket checkout lines, the relationship between the 87-year-old oil tycoon and the newly crowned Playboy Playmate of the Year was a source of endless mocking entertainment. But if you step out of the glare of the paparazzi flashbulbs and walk into the quiet, temperature-controlled office of his son, E. Pierce Marshall, the narrative shifts entirely. Pierce was not reading the tabloid gossip, he was reading the ledgers. And what those financial documents revealed was not a romance, but a catastrophic, uncontrolled financial hemorrhage. This was not simply a case of an old man spending his fortune. His wealth was being actively weaponized, and the meticulous, towering intellect of J. Howard Marshall had been reduced to signing blank checks in a desperate bid for survival. The mechanics of this transactional relationship were meticulously documented. Many legal filings and subsequent court testimonies paint a staggering picture of the wealth transfer occurring during these years. Marshall did not merely buy Anna Nicole Smith gifts. He essentially incorporated her into his portfolio as a massive, depreciating asset. He was footing the bill for her sprawling entourage, her high-priced publicists, her luxury travel, and her 24-hour demands. In one highly documented instance, Marshall was wheeled into a high-end jeweler and proceeded to purchase millions of dollars worth of diamonds in a single sitting simply because she pointed at them. He was treating the accumulation of her jewelry the same way he used to treat the accumulation of oil refineries, as a demonstration of absolute dominance. But here is the drama-filled contradiction. In the boardroom, his capital bought him total obedience. In the bedroom, his capital bought him absolutely nothing but humiliation. The vivid visual of their day-to-day reality perfectly physicalized his emotional void. Marshall had spent a fortune to mold Anna Nicole Smith into a global icon, paying for the surgeries and the lifestyle that launched her Guess Jeans campaign. But the immediate result of making her famous was that she was suddenly entirely unavailable to him. While her face was plastered on towering billboards towering from Sunset Boulevard to Times Square, the man who paid for the canvas was sitting completely alone in his silent, heavily fortified Houston mansion. He would reportedly wait by the telephone in his wheelchair, an 88-year-old billionaire, reduced to the emotional state of a desperate teenager, hoping the woman on his payroll might find a spare 10 minutes to call him between Hollywood photo shoots. He had purchased a companion to stave off the terrifying silence of his home, but the companion was never there. He bought the illusion of vitality, but the product was never delivered. It remains a paradox how a man who outmaneuvered the brightest legal minds of the 20th century allowed himself to be so transparently exploited. Many biographers suggest the answer lies at the very core of his psychological decay. Marshall likely knew exactly what was happening. He was a prisoner of his own transaction, but he was a willing prisoner. His intellect was still sharp enough to understand the transactional nature of her affection, but his emotional void was so profound that he accepted the terms anyway. He preferred the public mockery of being a sugar daddy over the private, terrifying reality of being an irrelevant, dying widow. He believed that as long as the checks were clearing, he was still a player in the game. He was using his checkbook as a defibrillator, trying to shock his own failing heart back into relevance. It was the ultimate tragic miscalculation of a man who believed that every human interaction could be negotiated on a balance sheet. Yet every transaction demands a final settlement, and Pierce Marshall was silently preparing to close the ledger for good. Pierce was watching his father degrade the pristine conservative legacy of the Marshall family name. The pristine reputation that had once commanded the respect of the Allied War Command was now a punchline on late-night television. Pierce viewed Anna Nicole Smith as a parasitic anomaly that needed to be legally excised from the corporate body. He began quietly consulting with teams of estate lawyers, preparing the complex legal traps that would eventually sever her from the fortune. He was documenting Marshall's physical decline, gathering the necessary evidence to prove that the great architect of the American oil industry was no longer of sound mind. Pierce was waiting for his father to make one final, fatal mistake. And in the sweltering Texas summer of 1994, J. Howard Marshall II delivered that mistake on a silver platter. Up to this point, despite the millions of dollars changing hands, there was still a thin legal boundary protecting the core of the Marshall estate. But on June 27, 1994, driven by a desperate, clawing need to permanently bind her to his fading existence, the 89-year-old billionaire married the 26-year-old model. The visual of the ceremony at the White Dove Wedding Chapel in Houston is burned into the historical record, and it is the very definition of grotesque. Anna Nicole Smith arrived in a cleavage-bearing white gown, posing for the cameras with practiced perfection. Beside her, J. Howard Marshall sat slumped in his wheelchair, wearing a white suit, his head trembling, his eyes glassy and vacant. He looked less like a groom and more like a hostage. For Marshall, the wedding functioned as the ultimate, albeit disastrous, behavioral contract. To Marshall, placing that ring on her finger was his final act of defiance against old age, a public declaration that he could still command the beauty of youth. But to Pierce Marshall, the wedding bells were a declaration of total war. The parasite had officially breached the inner sanctum of the family trust. The legal perimeter had been compromised. By trying to purchase immortality through a marriage certificate, Marshall had unwittingly handed his son the exact ammunition required to tear his life apart. And this is where things really get dirty. Because almost immediately after the flashbulbs faded and the wedding cake was cut, the invincible machinery of J. Howard Marshall's body completely and irreversibly collapsed, leaving him entirely at the mercy of the son who had spent a lifetime learning how to destroy his enemies. The echoes of the wedding bells from the White Dove Chapel had barely faded into the sweltering Houston summer of 1994, when the ultimate, terrifying reality of biology reasserted its dominance over J. Howard Marshall II. He had purchased his 26-year-old bride, successfully executing the final transaction of his life to stave off the humiliation of aging. But while his checkbook could manipulate the tabloid headlines, it possessed zero jurisdiction over the multiplying cells within his own stomach. Just weeks after the highly publicized nuptials, the 89-year-old billionaire was diagnosed with late-stage gastric cancer. The diagnosis was a devastating poetic cruelty for a man of his specific psychological architecture. Here was a titan of industry who had spent his 8 decades aggressively consuming the world. He had devoured rival corporations, swallowed up massive tracts of oil-rich land across the American Midwest, and consumed the time, youth, and affection of anyone he could afford to buy. Yet at the absolute zenith of his financial accumulation, his own body violently revolted against the very act of consumption. The cancer aggressively attacked his digestive tract, stripping away his physical ability to swallow. The mastermind who had once feasted on the American dream could no longer take in a single drop of water or a morsel of food naturally. He was kept alive solely by a percutaneous endoscopic gastrostomy tube, a plastic feeding line surgically driven directly through his abdomen into his stomach. His universe, which had once spanned from the strategic war rooms of Washington, D.C., to the sprawling refineries of Minnesota, instantly collapsed into the terrifying sterile dimensions of a motorized hospital bed. In this harrowing state of physical decay, the consequences of his lifelong philosophy became impossible to ignore. As he lay tethered to a feeding pump in the cavernous master suite, the catastrophic failure of his lifelong philosophy was laid bare. His new wife, Anna Nicole Smith, the woman he had just crowned with a diamond wedding band, was not sitting vigil at his bedside, holding his hand through the darkest hours of the night. Funded by his limitless bank accounts, her career was skyrocketing. She was on movie sets, walking red carpets, and posing for magazines in Los Angeles and New York. Marshall was left under the clinical, indifferent supervision of a rotating army of paid private nurses. He had spent millions of dollars to acquire a mirror that would reflect his vitality. But the mirror was 3,000 miles away, and he was left staring at the terrifying reality of his own rapidly failing body. He was surrounded by millions of dollars in museum-quality art, but he was starving for the one thing his wealth had failed to secure: genuine, uncompensated human devotion. This agonizing stasis held until January of 1995, when the midpoint peak of our tragedy arrived, pivoting on an incident so incredibly mundane that it borders on the absurd. Anna Nicole Smith had returned to Houston for a brief visit. According to court documents later filed by E. Pierce Marshall, Anna Nicole Smith bypassed her husband's feeding tube to administer broth orally. Legal records claim this resulted in severe aspiration, flooding his weakened lungs and starving his brain of oxygen. The broth triggered a severe choking fit, starving his brain of oxygen and sending his already fragile cardiovascular system into a state of extreme medical distress. He was rushed to a Houston emergency room, his life hanging by the absolute thinnest of threads, a $1.6 billion empire, and a 16-year legal war that would eventually consume the United States Supreme Court did not begin with a hostile corporate raid or a complex stock manipulation. It began with a spoonful of broth. To the tabloid media, this event was just another bizarre, tragicomic footnote in the chaotic circus of the Anna Nicole Smith phenomenon. However, viewed through the cold, calculating eyes of his son, E. Pierce Marshall, the chicken soup incident was not a tragic matrimonial accident. It was the smoking gun. It was the exact tactical opening the younger Marshall had been ruthlessly waiting for. Pierce was executing the exact training his father had instilled in him, viewing the world through the cold, unforgiving metrics of corporate defense. He had watched his father treat family members like disposable assets for decades. Now, Pierce was simply applying his father's own logic to a hostile takeover scenario. To Pierce, those medical charts were not a tragedy. They were irrefutable, court-admissible evidence of gross negligence. He saw the perfect legal weapon. Pierce Marshall immediately mobilized his teams of elite estate attorneys. Bypassing the hospital entirely, Pierce mobilized his legal team and rushed to the courthouse to file an emergency petition. He weaponized the chicken soup incident, arguing before a Texas judge that Anna Nicole Smith was not merely a gold digger draining the estate's liquid assets, but a direct physical threat to his father's very survival. He presented the medical records of the aspiration, the astronomical credit card bills, and the sheer physical frailty of the billionaire, weaving a compelling legal narrative that J. Howard Marshall II was no longer capable of protecting himself from his own catastrophic choices. Pierce demanded temporary legal guardianship over the man who had once advised the President of the United States. The courtroom decision that followed is one of the most staggering, humiliating reversals of fortune in modern American jurisprudence. The judge reviewed the evidence of Marshall's failing body, his heavily medicated mind, and the chaotic presence of his young wife. The gavel came down with the finality of a guillotine. The petition for temporary guardianship was granted. In a single devastating stroke of a pen, J. Howard Marshall II, the former Yale prodigy, the ruthless corporate raider, the author of the Connolly Hot Oil Act, was declared legally incompetent. He was stripped of all autonomous rights. The mastermind had been completely outmastered by the very machinery of the law he had spent a lifetime perfecting. He could no longer manage his own bank accounts. He could no longer dictate his own medical care. He could not even legally choose who was allowed to walk through the front door of his own home. The architect of the American energy sector had been legally reduced to the status of an infant. When J. Howard Marshall was finally discharged from the hospital, he was not returning to a sanctuary. The legal trap his son had sprung was absolute, and the environment he was returning to had been fundamentally altered. Up to this point, Marshall still possessed the illusion that he was a free man living in a mansion he owned, spending his money exactly how he saw fit. The bitter irony was that the very fortune he had hoarded to protect his freedom was now being used to finance his total imprisonment. The papers had been signed, the legal authority had irreversibly shifted, and the 90-year-old Titan was about to be wheeled back into a sprawling River Oaks estate that had been quietly, ruthlessly transformed into a gilded supermax prison. And this is where the cold, calculating revenge of a neglected son truly begins to suffocate the father, erasing any remaining shred of his dignity behind locked doors. When the ambulance doors opened and J. Howard Marshall II was wheeled back into his sprawling River Oaks estate in the early spring of 1995, he was crossing the threshold into a maximum security panopticon. The visual transformation of his environment is one of the most chilling aspects of this entire historical record. This was a mansion he had built to project absolute financial supremacy. It was a fortress filled with museum-quality art, imported Persian rugs, and the quiet, temperature-controlled hum of unimaginable wealth. But now, as his wheelchair rolled over the threshold, He was greeted not by the deferential nods of his household staff, but by the cold, assessing stares of armed off-duty police officers. E. Pierce Marshall, wielding the temporary guardianship order like a newly forged broadsword, had immediately militarized the estate. Security cameras originally installed to monitor the perimeter and keep intruders out were abruptly turned inward. They were repositioned to monitor the captive billionaire within his own bedroom. The mastermind who had once utilized the federal government's surveillance apparatus to track the illicit flow of Texas crude oil was now the subject of 24-hour surveillance in his own home. He was a prisoner, paying the salaries of his own wardens out of his own frozen bank accounts. Pierce Marshall's takeover was executed with sheer clinical efficiency. Rather than acting out of a sudden fit of rage, he orchestrated a meticulously planned corporate restructuring, exactly as his father had taught him to do. J. Howard Marshall had raised his son to believe that familial loyalty was secondary to the preservation of capital. He had demonstrated through his clinical divorce of Pierce's mother decades earlier that human beings were essentially liabilities that could be legally excised when they threatened the bottom line. Now, Pierce was simply applying that exact same ruthless transactional logic to his father's new wife. He viewed Anna Nicole Smith not as a stepmother, and certainly not as a grieving spouse, but as a catastrophic financial leak that needed to be aggressively plugged, and he possessed the absolute legal authority to turn off the tap. The sanctions Pierce imposed were breathtaking in their cruelty, providing a stunning drama-filled contradiction to the extravagant neon-lit spending spree of the previous 3 years. Anna Nicole Smith, the woman Marshall had literally showered with millions of dollars in diamonds, cars, and real estate, was suddenly treated like a hostile foreign agent. Pierce completely severed her limitless financial allowance. The credit cards were canceled. The endless flow of crisp $100 bills ceased entirely. But the most devastating restriction was physical. Pierce banned her from freely entering the home. He rationed her access to her own husband, restricting her visits to a tightly monitored, humiliating 30 minutes a day. When she was permitted to enter the River Oaks mansion, she was flanked by armed guards the entire time. She was strictly forbidden from being alone with the paralyzed billionaire. She was not allowed to close the bedroom door. The man who had spent tens of millions of dollars to buy her constant, highly publicized attention could now not even afford to buy her a 31st minute of visitation. The internal reality of his final months was defined by profound physical and emotional isolation. His physical deterioration was absolute. He was bedridden, suffering from painful multiplying bed sores that mapped the decay of his flesh. He was nourished entirely by the plastic tube protruding from his stomach. His voice, which had once boomed across the lecture halls of Yale Law School, was reduced to a fragile, incoherent rasp. Yet medical experts and legal testimonies suggest that beneath the heavy fog of painkillers, his magna cum laude intellect remained at least partially intact. And that is the true nightmare of this scenario. He was acutely aware of his own powerlessness. He was a genius of the American legal system, trapped in a rotting body, watching his own son use the very mechanics of probate law to strip away his last shreds of dignity. He could not scream. He could not lift a telephone to summon his own lawyers. He was forced to lie in silence, staring at the ceiling while the armed guards paced the hallways of his own home. This period offers a powerful historical comparison, a psychological irony so profound it almost feels written by a playwright. Decades earlier, Marshall had drafted the Connolly Hot Oil Act to stop renegade drillers from illegally siphoning off American wealth. He had built his reputation on stopping the unauthorized bleeding of assets. Now, in the spring of 1995, his son was using a Texas judge's order to stop his father from illegally siphoning off the family's wealth to a stripper. Pierce had become the enforcer, and his father had become the renegade liability. The student had completely, flawlessly overtaken the master. The transactional philosophy Marshall had championed his entire life had finally reached its ultimate, terrifying conclusion. He was no longer a father, a husband, or a titan of industry. He was simply a line item on Pierce Marshall's balance sheet, a depreciating asset that needed to be heavily managed until it finally expired. As the spring bled into the sweltering heat of the Texas summer, the gilded prison entered its final, most controversial phase. The temporary guardianship was solid, but Pierce needed to ensure that the $1.6 billion Coke Industries fortune was permanently shielded from Anna Nicole Smith long after his father's heart stopped beating. The master suite of the River Oaks mansion was transformed from a medical ward into a makeshift legal war room. Teams of high-priced estate attorneys, paid for by Pierce, began filtering into the bedroom. They brought with them stacks of complex, irrevocable trust documents and heavily revised wills. The exact nature of what transpired in those quiet, highly guarded hours remains the subject of bitter historical and legal dispute. But the physical reality of the moment is undeniable and visually grotesque. In the master suite, J. Howard Marshall II, 90 years old and weighing barely more than a child, heavily medicated and slipping in and out of consciousness, is propped up against his pillows. An expensive pen is placed into his trembling, skeletal hand. He is surrounded by lawyers he did not hire, acting on the orders of a son he could not control. He is then guided to sign his name to documents that completely rewrite the legacy of his life. Through these altered estate plans, every single trace of Anna Nicole Smith was systematically eradicated from the financial future of the Marshall Empire. The woman he had married just months prior in a highly publicized, desperate bid for youth was entirely disinherited. The immense compounding wealth of his Coke Industries stock was fortified in a trust designed to benefit Pierce Marshall and Pierce Marshall alone. Did the brilliant architect of the Allied oil supply fully understand what he was signing? Decades of subsequent litigation, reaching all the way to the United States Supreme Court, would eventually rule that the documents were legally binding. Beyond the legal verdict lay a chilling reality of profound moral bankruptcy. Marshall had spent his entire life treating human beings as variables in a contract. In his final desperate hours, he became the victim of his own worldview. He was forced to sign a contract that erased his last pathetic attempt at finding human connection. He signed away his autonomy in a room guarded by mercenaries, orchestrated by a son who had learned all too well that love is an illusion, but a legally binding signature is forever. By late July of 1995, the ink on the irrevocable trust was dry. The legal perimeter was fully secured. The financial hemorrhage had been completely stopped. There was nothing left for Pierce Marshall to do but wait, and there was nothing left for J. Howard Marshall II to do but die. His body was failing rapidly, succumbing to a severe bout of pneumonia that his compromised immune system could not fight. He was transferred from his gilded prison back to a hospital room, a frail, broken shell of a man who had once commanded the respect of the free world. The transaction was finally complete. The billionaire had paid the ultimate price for his lifelong emotional isolation, and the terrifying finale of his existence was only days away. The stage was now perfectly set for a death that would offer no dignity, no peace, and no resolution, but would instead serve as the opening gunshot for the most vicious, spectacle-driven legal war in American history. On August 4th, 1995, J. Howard Marshall II succumbed to severe pneumonia. Even in death, his fractured legacy manifested in two bitterly divided funerals, a highly publicized performative spectacle orchestrated by Anna Nicole Smith, and a closed, chillingly corporate service held by E. Pierce Marshall. Neither room radiated the kind of genuine human warmth that his billions of dollars had failed to purchase. What immediately followed was a 16-year financial bloodbath over a $1.6 billion estate that reached the United States Supreme Court twice. Ultimately, the justice system upheld the heavily contested trusts, awarding the Coke industry's fortune to Pierce and leaving Anna with nothing. In a cynical twist of fate, both heirs would die suddenly before the legal war fully concluded, consumed by the very inheritance they fought for. Marshall possessed one of the greatest analytical minds of his generation, an indispensable architect of the Allied victory. Yet his final days remain history's ultimate warning. A man can manipulate the law and hoard the wealth of nations, but he can never, under any circumstances, purchase his way out of the dark.